Hello, my name is Vitania Quinlan, and I'm going to be looking at the philosophical model analysis for two theorists. The two theorists that I'm going to be looking at is Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Jane Addams. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is from the Enlightenment period. Jane Addams was from the Progressive era. My thesis for this is that Jane Addams was a dynamic, intentional, community-based, action-oriented pragmatist in comparison to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was speculative and romanticized. Looking at these two theorists, it's important to first consider the background and cultural context. In terms of the Enlightenment, it was a period of time in which the theorists and the researchers sought to explain everyday occurrences. They wanted to look at the scientific method as a means of disproving the mythical unknown. They sought to challenge the status quo, which was usually set by the church. Jane Addams, on the other hand, was during the Progressive era. This is post-Civil War America, where the immigrants were coming in from Europe. The workers were coming from what used to be plantations, and they were seeking work in the cities. She was heavily dependent on a Protestant ideology at the time, and that in turn shaped her educational policies. Looking at Rousseau, when we consider philosophy on education, it's important to first consider his childhood experiences. His mother died during childbirth. He was raised by his father until the age of approximately 10 or 12, upon when his father abandoned him, and he went to live with a pastor who served as his tutor. The pastor claimed that he broke a comb. He was called upon to be disciplined by his uncle, and as a result ran away, and life was different ever since. Some of the major influences that impacted his work were the cyclical nature of the world, of life, of nature itself. Using that as an inspiration, as a truth, he then turned to learn by example. And we'll talk a little bit about learning by example later. If a student did those things, if a teacher was able to attain the ideal student, then the result was a good citizen, a good father, a good husband, a good spouse, a good friend. So that's what he sought in his practices. Important to the consideration of Rousseau is his writing of the book Emile. Emile depicts an ideal learning environment where Rousseau puts himself as the tutor, and he is able to answer those what if questions. What if we did have an ideal situation? What if we had an ideal community? What if I raised the 5 children that I fathered? What would that life look like? When looking at Addams, it was a completely different dynamic. Addams was raised by her father. He was a Republican state senator for the state of Illinois. Her mother did die when she was at a young age, but she had a stepmother who stepped in and who was a doctor, and so she helped in the rearing of Jane Addams. She had a very strong Protestant upbringing, which was different from Rousseau. Some of the major influences that shaped her ideology was a trip to Europe, where she was able to witness work similar to what happened at Hull House. Her concept of a socialized democracy, a world where everyone had equal rights, where they were treated fairly, and then her work in Chicago. Her work in Chicago led to the development of the Hull House, which in turn we see socialized education. We see her labeled in many places as the first social worker because community needs drove the services, the research, the work that she did. In theories of practice, Rousseau and Addams both had a great impact on some of the instrumental educational theorists of the time. Rousseau, you see the work of Johann Pestalozzi. He came up with systematic approaches of training teachers. From Pelosi, we also see Frederick Froebel, the father of kindergarten. In Addams, it was hard to find those people that impacted her work, as a lot of her work stemmed from the actual needs of the community. However, we do see her working closely with John Dewey and George Herbert Mead. According to Wendell, George Herbert Mead was the theorist for social interactionalism, and he would sit and he would brainstorm with Adams on social reform. John Dewey, a lot of his research that he did while in Chicago was linked to the Hull House and the work that Adams was doing as well. Bruce even made the claim that the work that Dewey did later in his career in terms of shaping ideology and theories were based on the action research that Adams completed herself. In terms of perspectives on diversity, Rousseau believed that all education should be available for all. Education was needed to be free of religion, free of that entitlement, that the curriculum needed to evolve around nature, and that it needed to be a result of scientific method. Adams, on the other hand, was linked to culture. She believed in socialized education and that the more you interacted and engaged with a variety of people, the better your self of community will be. There was a connection and integration for everything that the community needed. Even though Pestalozzi was one of Rousseau's biggest supporters, he was also a critic. Through the actual implementation of Rousseau's practices, Pestalozzi found that Rousseau really needed to consider the psychological elements of a child before he can create this ideal setting. Another critic of Rousseau was Maria Montessori. A doctor, trained doctor, Montessori believed in the patterns of development pointed out by Rousseau. However, she called his work speculative and not clinical in nature in terms of the observations. John Dewey, he also had issues with Adams. However, the issues that he pointed up and publicly debated were more social and societal in nature, such as the World War I, the approaches that she was taking there. Implications for this is that Jane Addams epitomized action research. Her work can be implemented today in that it was derived from the needs of those that she worked with. It wasn't something that was fictitious. It wasn't brought up on a book. It was trial and error, and she changed and evolved as she worked with these people. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, on the other hand, did not implement his ideologies and theories, and his thoughts, yes, inspired others, but in terms of him and how it worked, he didn't do it. So he didn't know. He didn't raise a child. He didn't tutor, teach, versus Jane Addams, who did all of the above. My resources, thank you very much, and have a great day.